The air inside courtroom 7B carried the weight of winter and institutional arrogance. Outside, February snow had turned to gray slush against the courthouse steps, but inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly dry, heavy with the smell of old wood polish, stale cigarette smoke, and the particular odor of power exercised without conscience. Judge Walter H. Kensington sat elevated behind his bench like a king surveying his domain, his black robe pristine, his silver hair perfectly combed, his narrow lips curved in the faint smile of a man who believed he owned every soul in his courtroom. For 23 years, Kensington had wielded his gavel like a weapon against Harlem. His reputation stretched from the marble halls of City Hall to the barber shops on 125th Street, a man who handed down maximum sentences to black defendants with the mechanical precision of an executioner. The legal community whispered that if you drew Kensington's courtroom, you were already buried. The street corners of Harlem knew him by a different name, the Hammer of Harlem. 12 feet from the bench, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat motionless at the defendant's table, charcoal gray suit pressed to razor precision, white shirt crisp as fresh snow, tie knotted with military discipline. His hands rested flat on the polished wood, steady as stone. No jewelry, no visible weakness. Just that face, calm, unreadable, the face of a man who had survived Alcatraz, mob wars, and the chess game of Harlem politics because he understood one fundamental truth: real power isn't loud, it's patient. The second hand on the courtroom clock dragged past the 12. 11:24 a.m. Assistant District Attorney Charles Whitfield rose from the prosecution table, his Harvard law confidence radiating like expensive cologne. Third-generation Ivy League, connected family, a man who saw this hearing not as justice, but as career advancement. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and smiled without warmth. "Your Honor," Whitfield began, his voice carrying the casual contempt of inherited privilege, "the people are prepared to proceed with sentencing, assuming the defendant has finally decided to abandon his." Creative interpretations of the law. A low murmur rippled through the packed gallery. Harlem eyes, Harlem ears. They recognized the tone. Not law, but theater. Public humiliation disguised as jurisprudence. Judge Kensington leaned forward, savoring the moment. This was his stage, his performance, his demonstration of who truly controlled the fate of men like Ellsworth Johnson. "Mr. Johnson," the judge said, his voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade, "this court has been more than patient with your delays, your appeals, your street lawyer theatrics. You are not in some Harlem social club. You are in my courtroom, where the law, real law, is dispensed." He paused, letting his words settle like dust on a coffin lid. "You have been convicted of operating an illegal numbers racket, corrupting public officials, and showing contempt for the lawful authority of this city. I will not waste another minute listening to your fabricated stories about police misconduct or planted evidence. You are a parasite feeding on the weakness of your own people." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. In the gallery, an elderly woman in a blue coat closed her eyes. She remembered her grandson, sentenced by this same judge to 8 years on a first offense. She remembered the way Kensington had smiled when he'd called the boy another statistic. On the defense table in front of Bumpy sat a thin manila folder, a legal pad, a fountain pen, and one object that didn't belong in any courtroom: a small, black reel-to-reel tape recorder. Professional grade, leather carrying strap, the kind reporters used. The metal surface reflected the fluorescent lights like a mirror. 11:25 a.m. Therefore, Judge Kensington continued, his voice rising with theatrical authority. "It is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to 7 to 10 years in Sing Sing Correctional Facility with no possibility of parole for Your Honor." Bumpy's voice cut through the courtroom like a scalpel. Low, calm, the kind of voice that made hardened criminals stop breathing. Kensington's face flushed red. "You will not interrupt this court, Mr. Johnson." Bailiff, if the defendant speaks again without permission, it's about your conversation with Detective Morrison. Bumpy's hand moved slowly, deliberately, toward the tape recorder. The conversation you had in your chambers last Tuesday, 9:47 p.m., the one where you discussed how much the Genovese family was paying you to make sure I stayed buried long enough for them to carve up my territory. The courtroom went silent. The only sound was the rain against the windows and the soft mechanical hum of the building's heating system. Judge Kensington's hand froze halfway to his gavel. His face drained of color, going from red to ash white in 3 seconds. Bumpy placed his finger on the tape recorder's play button. "See, Judge," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a chess master announcing checkmate. "You refused to listen to me, but I figured maybe you'd listen to yourself." He pressed play. The voice that emerged from the small speaker was unmistakable. Kensington's voice, clear, unguarded, discussing dollar amounts, discussing timelines, discussing how the Johnson problem would be permanently solved. On the bench, Judge Kensington began to sweat. Small beads formed along his hairline, betraying what his judicial robe could not hide. His hand trembled against the polished wood. In 6 minutes, this courtroom would erupt in chaos. In 4 days, federal investigators would arrive with subpoenas. In 3 weeks, Walter H. Kensington would resign in disgrace, his 23-year career reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in legal circles. And before the month ended, he would find a single chess piece, a white king, lying on its side, on his desk at home, along with a note in precise block letters. Checkmate. The game is over. The story of how Judge Walter H. Kensington lost everything is a warning that history has tried to hide. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now, let's go back to February 10th, 1958. The distance between the marble steps of Manhattan Criminal Court and the cracked sidewalks of 125th Street in 1958 was not measured in miles, but in power. Downtown's judicial elite operated processing centers where black lives were converted into statistics, where justice wore white robes and spoke in the calculated language of systematic oppression. The criminal courts functioned as a conveyor belt of destruction, designed not to serve but to crush, transforming human beings into docket numbers and case files that would never see daylight again. Judge Walter H. Kensington had perfected this machinery over 23 years of methodical brutality. His courtroom was a slaughterhouse of potential, where maximum sentences flowed like water and mercy was treated as a disease requiring eradication. Behind the performance of judicial dignity, in the privacy of his chambers, Kensington abandoned all pretense. The racial slurs came as naturally as breathing. His philosophy was surgical in its simplicity. Harlem needed to be kept in line, and fear was the most effective scalpel for cutting away resistance. The victims accumulated like unmarked graves. Marcus Williams, 16 years old, caught shoplifting a winter coat, was tried as an adult and given 5 years in adult prison where childhood went to die. James Patterson, Korean War veteran with a Purple Heart and shrapnel still embedded in his leg, was arrested for running numbers to feed his family after the VA denied his disability claim. Kensington dismissed his military service with a wave and sentenced him to 8 years, sneering that the Army had returned broken goods to his city. Dorothy Henderson, single mother working weekend cleaning jobs without reporting the income, was separated from her 3 children for 18 months, ensuring those kids learned early that the system existed to tear their family apart. At private dinners in the Yale Club, Kensington held court over rare steaks and aged scotch, explaining his judicial philosophy to ambitious prosecutors and senior detectives. The racial contempt was never explicit in these refined settings, always wrapped in respectable language about maintaining order and public safety. He would lean across the white tablecloth, swirling his glass and deliver his core belief to men like Assistant District Attorney Charles Whitfield. You don't prune the weeds, you salt the earth. Whitfield absorbed these lessons with the hunger of a man who understood that career advancement required learning to weaponize the legal system, to use statutes and procedures as instruments of control rather than justice. The terror of courtroom 7B filtered back to Harlem through invisible networks of survival. In barbershops along Lenox Avenue, men warned each other in whispered voices about drawing Kensington's docket. In church basements after Sunday services, mothers prayed specifically that their sons would never stand before that particular bench. On street corners where information moved faster than newspapers, everyone understood the fundamental mathematics. Kensington plus a black defendant equaled automatic burial. The system was rigged, but knowing it was rigged provided only the cold comfort of understanding your fate before it arrived. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson observed this machinery of oppression with the attention of a man who understood that effective resistance required systematic intelligence. He was not simply managing numbers rackets and protection territories. He was functioning as an unauthorized guardian of a besieged community, paying legal fees for families who couldn't afford representation, studying judicial patterns like a general mapping enemy positions, intervening when sentences crossed from harsh into genocidal. Bumpy maintained detailed records of Kensington's cases, documenting the systematic destruction, understanding that information was the foundation of any effective counterattack. The breaking point arrived on a cold February morning when Bumpy sat in the gallery of courtroom 7B, watching Kensington destroy 19-year-old Thomas Green. The boy had been arrested with $47 in small bills, guilty of nothing more than trying to help his grandmother pay rent. The evidence was flimsy, the police testimony contradictory. None of it mattered. Kensington barely glanced at the probation report recommending supervision as he delivered 7 years without hesitation, without consideration of age or circumstance or the disproportionate cruelty of the punishment. As the bailiffs led the sobbing teenager away in handcuffs, Kensington leaned back in his chair and muttered to his clerk, just loud enough for the front row to hear, another Harlem statistic. That evening, Bumpy sat alone in his office above a legitimate dry cleaning business on Lenox Avenue. The room was quiet except for distant traffic and the soft click of chess pieces against mahogany. He moved the pieces slowly, methodically, playing both sides of a game only he could see. His Lieutenant Vincent stood by the door, watching the ritual unfold. Finally, Vincent broke the silence with the question that hung in the air like cigarette smoke. "What are we going to do about the kid's sentence, boss?" Bumpy's hand moved across the board with surgical precision. His black queen slid diagonally, capturing the white king and laying it on its side. The wooden piece hit the board with a sharp, final crack that seemed to echo through the quiet room. He looked up at Vincent, his face showing nothing, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had decided that patience had expired and consequences were now inevitable. "We're going to teach the judge about consequences." February 10th, 1958. Judge Kensington's chambers at 10:47 a.m. existed in a reality where judicial dignity was a costume discarded between performances. The whiskey came out before noon, amber liquid catching winter light through windows overlooking Center Street. Kensington's black robe hung open like a abandoned theater wardrobe, revealing the expensive suit underneath and the comfortable slouch of a man who believed this room was sanctuary. Assistant District Attorney Charles Whitfield occupied the leather chair across from the judge's mahogany desk, his Harvard law posture relaxed into honest conspiracy. Detective Frank Morrison stood near the bookshelf, cigarette smoke curling despite regulations that applied to lesser mortals. The language bore no resemblance to careful courtroom terminology. Racial slurs flowed as naturally as the whiskey, brutal assessments delivered without shame or hesitation. They discussed Ellsworth Johnson not as a defendant, but as a tumor requiring surgical removal, a problem that had grown beyond tolerance. Kensington leaned back, swirling his glass, outlining strategy with the confidence of a man who had executed this playbook dozens of times without consequence. His voice carried the casual authority of absolute power, each word a nail in someone else's coffin. The conspiracy was comprehensive and surgical. Morrison would fabricate evidence through a confidential informant who existed only on paper, manufacturing probable cause for searches that would conveniently discover pre-planted narcotics in Bumpy's operations. 3 witnesses had already been selected for coercion through dropped charges and direct threats against their families, each prepared to testify to specific incidents that never occurred. The timeline was predetermined: arrest within 2 weeks, trial within 3 months, sentencing designed not just for conviction, but for public breaking. 15 to 20 years minimum, ensuring Bumpy would emerge as an old man if he emerged at all. Kensington set his glass down with deliberate precision and delivered his core philosophy in words that revealed the true machinery beneath judicial robes. You don't negotiate with these people. You break their backs so their children learn fear. That's how you maintain order. That's how civilization survives. Whitfield absorbed this wisdom with the hunger of ambition, already calculating how this lesson would accelerate his career trajectory through the district attorney's office toward political prominence. Morrison's role extended beyond simple evidence fabrication into systematic coordination with the Genovese crime family, who waited eagerly to carve up Bumpy's territory once legal machinery removed him from the board. The detective would ensure police protection disappeared from strategic blocks, that rival operations received advance warning of enforcement actions, that the power vacuum would be filled by more cooperative criminal elements. Morrison stubbed out his cigarette and confirmed the timeline with military precision. The fatal mistake was woven into every word. Kensington operated from absolute assumption of sanctuary, believing his chambers existed beyond consequence. 23 years of unchallenged power had calcified into arrogance. The concept that a black man from Harlem could penetrate these white institutional spaces was simply unthinkable. He poured another round, laughing at some private joke about broken dreams and shattered resistance. What none of them noticed was the young black court porter emptying trash cans near the window. Jerome Williams moved through chambers like furniture, invisible to men who never saw people like him as fully human. He absorbed every word while maintaining careful blankness, understanding enough to recognize systematic corruption, enough to know this information could destroy lives or save them. The intelligence reached Bumpy through Harlem's underground network within 6 hours. Jerome whispered to his barber cousin. The barber mentioned it to a church deacon. The deacon carried it to basement meetings, where community protection was discussed in careful code. By midnight, Bumpy received detailed accounts of the conversation, timeline, players, manufactured evidence strategy. His reaction contained no rage, no wasted emotional display. After 15 minutes of calculation, he dialed a memorized number. "It's me," he said simply. "I need your particular skills." Bumpy hung up and turned to his inner circle. The judge thinks his robe makes him God. Time to show him what real power looks like. Samuel Washington earned his reputation in Harlem through precision work that left no traces, installations that functioned flawlessly under impossible conditions. The electrician operated from a cramped workshop above a legitimate radio repair shop, surrounded by oscilloscopes, vacuum tubes, and the quiet hum of equipment the federal government insisted civilians didn't need. His background was Army Signal Corps, trained in electronic warfare and communications interception until he refused orders to train segregated units in 1945. The dishonorable discharge had cost him military pension and veteran benefits, but it had preserved something more valuable: his integrity. Now he worked exclusively for Harlem's protection, deploying technical expertise against the same system that had rejected him. The reconnaissance phase consumed 3 days of systematic observation, conducted with military discipline. Washington mapped courthouse security patterns, documenting guard rotations down to the minute, identifying blind spots in coverage, noting which doors remained unlocked during shift changes. He studied Kensington's routines through patient surveillance, arrival time at 9:23 a.m., without variation, lunch departure at 12:47 p.m. For exactly 53 minutes, chamber meetings typically scheduled between 10:30 a.m. and 11:45 a.m. When background noise provided acoustic cover, chamber layouts were obtained through careful questioning of cleaning staff who remembered every bookshelf and furniture placement because their survival depended on leaving no trace. Technical preparation required resources that existed only in professional intelligence circles. Washington acquired a German-manufactured reel-to-reel recorder designed for covert operations, compact enough to hide, but sophisticated enough to capture clear audio through walls. He spent 18 hours testing microphone sensitivity in environments matching courthouse acoustics, adjusting frequency response to filter out fact noise while preserving vocal clarity. Battery calculations were critical. The device needed 72 hours of continuous operation, requiring custom power configuration that Washington assembled by hand. The infiltration strategy centered on Marcus Green, a courthouse janitor who owed Bumpy for legal fees that had kept his brother out of prison. Green would plant the device during his regular cleaning rotation, concealing it inside a hollowed-out legal encyclopedia on Kensington's bookshelf. The volume was selected carefully, thick enough to house equipment, obscure enough that Kensington would never reference it, positioned at ear level where microphone placement would optimize audio capture. Green practiced the installation 47 times in Washington's workshop until he could complete it in under 90 seconds. The risk assessment was brutal and honest. Federal wiretapping laws carried potential life sentences for unauthorized surveillance. One mistake, one witness, one technical failure would result in federal prosecution that would destroy everyone involved. Washington explained this to Bumpy in clinical detail, outlining every scenario where the operation could collapse into catastrophe. Absolute precision and complete silence were mathematical requirements for survival. Bumpy assembled his inner circle in the back room of the Blue Lounge and delivered an ultimatum that carried the weight of finality. No leaks to girlfriends or drinking buddies. No boasts about outsmarting the system. No mistakes of any kind. Violation would result in permanent consequences that he did not need to specify because everyone understood exactly what permanent meant. The meeting ended in silence. The waiting game stretched across 48 hours of monitoring. Washington maintained surveillance from a converted delivery van, headphones clamped over his ears, recording reels turning in mechanical rhythm. Tuesday night, February 11th, at 9:47 p.m., Kensington's fatal meeting was recorded in comprehensive detail. Every racial epithet, every specific dollar amount from Genevieve's family payments, every timeline detail for Bumpy's destruction. The recovery operation required midnight infiltration. Green retrieved the device in 74 seconds, but a security guard deviated from his normal route. Green froze in a supply closet, equipment concealed under cleaning rags, breathing controlled while footsteps passed within 6 feet. In Washington's workshop, Bumpy listened to the recording for the first time. His face remained neutral, but his hands gripped the table edge until his knuckles turned white. "How's the sound quality?" Washington asked. Bumpy's response carried quiet satisfaction, clear enough for a courtroom. February 18th began with ritual preparation that transformed clothing into psychological armor. Bumpy selected his charcoal gray suit with surgical precision, each element calculated for maximum courtroom impact. The white shirt was pressed until it could cut paper. The tie knotted with military discipline that communicated absolute control. The tape recorder, wrapped in soft felt to prevent mechanical noise, rested inside his leather briefcase beneath legal documents and a worn Bible. Washington had modified the device for this moment. Wires coiled with mathematical order, volume preset for maximum impact. Bumpy checked the mechanism one final time before closing the latches with deliberate finality. Courtroom 7B was packed beyond capacity by 11 a.m., bodies pressed into every available space. The air carried the weight of old wood polish, stale cigarette smoke, and nervous sweat. Harlem residents who had taken morning shifts off work filled the gallery, their faces carrying collective experience with this particular judge. Italian crime family representatives occupied the back rows, anticipating territorial redistribution following Bumpy's removal. Reporters filled the press section expecting routine sentencing, already composing paragraphs about another criminal receiving deserved punishment. Kensington entered with theatrical authority, black robe billowing like a shroud. His performance began immediately, lecturing Bumpy about responsibility to community, about damage caused by criminal enterprise, about the absolute necessity of harsh justice to maintain social order. His whiskey breath was carefully masked with wintergreen lozenges, his voice carrying practiced gravitas of 23 years behind the bench. Each phrase was designed to establish moral superiority while manufacturing consent for predetermined destruction. The prosecution's case unfolded with manufactured precision. Assistant District Attorney Whitfield presented 3 witnesses who testified to specific incidents with rehearsed consistency. Detective Morrison described planted evidence as if reciting gospel truth, his chain of custody documentation appearing legitimate on surface examination. Coerced confessions were read into the record as voluntary admissions of guilt. The entire construction was presented as legitimate law enforcement, each element wrapped in procedural legitimacy that disguised its corrupt foundation. Kensington's arrogance escalated with each passing minute. He interrupted defense counsel mid-sentence, threatened contempt charges for objections he deemed frivolous, and publicly humiliated Bumpy with comments laced with racial undertones, carefully calibrated to avoid explicit slurs while communicating absolute contempt. The public humiliation was deliberate theater, designed to demonstrate that black men held no power in this marble temple of white authority. Bumpy's interruption cut through the performance like a scalpel. His voice was calm, almost conversational, as he mentioned specific details from Tuesday night's chamber meeting. The exact time, 9:47 p.m., the participants, the dollar amounts discussed. Kensington's face drained from judicial red to ash white in 3 seconds, blood abandoning his features as comprehension arrived. The tape recorder emerged from the briefcase with deliberate slowness. Bumpy placed it on the defense table, his finger hovering over the play button. The courtroom went silent except for breathing and mechanical systems. He pressed play. Kensington's voice filled the space, unmistakable and unguarded, discussing conspiracy with casual brutality. Each revealed phrase contradicted his judicial oath. Each racial slur undermined authority he had wielded for 2 decades. Each admission of corruption exposed the machinery beneath the marble facade. Kensington's desperation manifested in escalating commands. He ordered bailiffs to seize the recorder, but they hesitated, understanding that touching evidence during active proceedings could destroy their careers. He threatened contempt charges, but the words carried no weight against recorded proof of judicial corruption. Bumpy stopped the tape at maximum impact, his timing surgical. He delivered a quiet ultimatum: dismiss all charges immediately, or the full recording would be delivered to every newspaper in New York before sunset. Kensington understood the trap with absolute clarity. His voice emerged as barely a whisper. All charges dismissed. He stood, removed his black robe with trembling hands, and walked out of courtroom 7B, never to return. For 3 seconds after Kensington vanished through the chamber door, courtroom 7B remained suspended in stunned silence, the air thick with the weight of institutional collapse. Then, chaos erupted with surgical precision. Reporters abandoned their seats and sprinted toward hallway telephones, fighting for lines to dictate breaking news that would redefine judicial corruption narratives. Italian crime family representatives melted through exits with practiced invisibility, understanding instantly that their territorial ambitions had evaporated alongside their purchased judge. The Harlem gallery remained seated in collective comprehension, processing the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Systematic white power dismantled, using its own arrogance as the weapon. The Department of Justice response arrived with mechanical precision that suggested prior surveillance operations. Federal investigators descended on Manhattan Criminal Court within 24 hours, armed with subpoenas, recording equipment, and authority that overrode local political considerations. They demanded the original recording, comprehensive witness testimony, and complete documentation of judicial corruption extending beyond one compromised judge. The federal interest was territorial rather than altruistic. Corruption of this magnitude threatened institutional legitimacy that Washington protected with prosecutorial violence. Agents seized files, sealed chambers, and began interviewing court staff suddenly eager to distance themselves from 23 years of systematic brutality. Bumpy navigated the investigation with characteristic strategic precision. He provided evidence through carefully structured legal channels, positioning himself as concerned citizen exposing corruption rather than criminal mastermind orchestrating revenge. His attorneys negotiated immunity agreements covering technical aspects of recording acquisition, transforming Bumpy from defendant into prosecutorial asset while preserving operational security about Harlem's intelligence networks. The cooperation was masterwork calculation. It converted potential criminal liability into essential witness status for federal prosecutors seeking career-defining headlines. Kensington's world collapsed with terrifying mathematical precision. Former colleagues who had shared whiskey and racial contempt in his chambers publicly denounced him with the speed of rats fleeing sinking vessels. The New York Times ran front-page expos detailing 23 years of maximum sentencing patterns against black defendants. Community groups marched outside the courthouse, demanding broader investigation into every verdict he had ever delivered. His Yale Club membership was quietly revoked. His wife filed separation papers within 72 hours. The isolation was absolute. Power that had seemed infinite evaporated instantly when stripped of institutional protection and exposed to public scrutiny. The investigation triggered systematic domino effects that devastated New York's legal establishment. Federal auditors examining Kensington's subpoenaed bank records discovered 6 years of payments from Genovese family intermediaries, each deposit corresponding to favorable rulings or harsh sentences against their competitors. Dozens of closed cases entered automatic review. Wrongful conviction appeals flooded the appellate system as defense attorneys recognized that every Kensington verdict was now legally suspect. 6 judges resigned quietly to avoid federal scrutiny. 11 police officers, including Detective Morrison, were arrested on corruption charges. 14 public officials faced indictment as the probe expanded into systematic networks. Bumpy's revenge was surgical in its completeness, eschewing physical violence for something far more destructive: the complete eradication of reputation, career, social standing, and financial security through systematic exposure. 3 weeks later, Kensington returned to his empty suburban house to find a single white chess piece lying on its side on his desk, accompanied by a note in precise block letters: "Checkmate. The game is over." That same night at 2:30 a.m., 4 Genovese family soldiers approached Bumpy's building on Lenox Avenue, testing defenses. His security team materialized from shadows with military precision. No shots were fired. No threats were spoken. The soldiers retreated after 30 seconds of silent confrontation, understanding the absolute message: Harlem remained unconquered. Walter H. Kensington stood before a federal judge in 1958, stripped of his robe and authority, receiving 12 years for racketeering, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. He served 8 years in Atlanta Federal Prison, where former judges occupied the lowest tier of inmate hierarchy, below informants and child predators. prison routine stripped away everything except the ordinary, small man beneath 23 years of judicial arrogance. Released in 1966, he emerged broken and forgotten, living out his final years in a rented room above a hardware store in New Jersey. He died alone in 1971, his 3-line obituary buried in newspaper back pages, making no mention of the empire of fear he once controlled from courtroom 7B. The corruption investigation unleashed by Bumpy's tape recorder carved through New York's judicial criminal complex with methodical brutality. Federal prosecutors assembled comprehensive charts mapping connections between judges, detectives, prosecutors, and organized crime intermediaries. The pattern was systematic: harsh sentences for black defendants, leniency for protected informants, selective enforcement targeting competition while preserving preferred criminal enterprises. Dozens of officials faced prosecution. Some went to prison. Others resigned quietly in exchange for cooperation. The entire structure trembled under scrutiny it had avoided for generations through careful maintenance of respectable appearances. For 4 years after Kensington's collapse, Bumpy Johnson existed in rare space as functionally untouchable. Local police departments hesitated to move against him, aware that any operation would attract federal examination they could not withstand. Italian crime families abandoned territorial ambitions in Harlem, understanding that the man who destroyed a federal judge possessed intelligence capabilities they could not match. He walked Lenox Avenue not just as a crime boss, but as a living legend who had beaten the white establishment at its own game, emerging with enhanced rather than diminished authority. The story underwent transformation through Harlem's oral tradition networks. In barbershops along Lenox Avenue, men recounted the moment Kensington's face turned white with the precision of gospel testimony. On street corners, teenagers whispered about the tape recorder that silenced a judge. Jazz clubs featured the legend during late-night sessions when musicians improvised riffs dedicated to the judge's silence, turning legal victory into cultural memory. Each retelling reinforced the fundamental narrative: intelligence and preparation could defeat institutional power that appeared invincible. Victory carried unintended consequences that arrived with federal precision. J. Edgar Hoover, obsessed with black leadership that challenged white authority, reclassified Bumpy from local criminal to national security threat. The FBI deployed resources previously reserved for foreign espionage, comprehensive wiretaps, physical surveillance teams, informants planted within his organization. The campaign was systematic and relentless, designed to neutralize his influence through constant pressure rather than legal conviction. The final irony was surgical in its completeness. The same surveillance tactics Bumpy had used against Kensington were now weaponized against him by federal resources that dwarfed anything available to Harlem's underground networks. The student had become the target, hunted by masters of the surveillance craft he had temporarily mastered. The original recording disappeared from federal custody in 1966, under circumstances never adequately explained. It was never formally entered as trial evidence due to technical questions about surveillance legality. Copies survived in private collections, preserved by lawyers and journalists who understood historical significance, occasionally surfacing in academic research about judicial corruption. Bumpy's philosophy was ultimately vindicated through demonstrated results. Real power wasn't violence or intimidation. It was understanding the system more thoroughly than those who created it, identifying vulnerabilities in structures that appeared impenetrable, deploying intelligence with surgical precision against arrogance that assumed invulnerability. On February 18, 1958, a black man from Harlem walked into a rigged courtroom and walked out free, leaving a judge's career in ruins. That wasn't just justice, that was revolution, and revolutions, once started, never truly end.